Cops insult black 10-year-old Prodigy. Her lawyer mom entered courtroom in fury. The courtroom fell silent as Imani Washington rose from her seat. Her tailored charcoal suit a stark contrast to the cold, sterile walls of courtroom 312. The fluorescent lights reflected off her rimless glasses as she approached the bench with measured steps that barely contained the fury coursing through her veins. Behind her, 10-year-old Zora sat ramrod straight, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the bright blue ribbon from the National Mathematics competition pinned to her cardigan. "Your Honor," Imani's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "What happened to my daughter yesterday wasn't just an insult. It was a symptom of something far more insidious in our justice system." She turned slightly, her gaze locking with Officer Brendan Miller's, who shifted uncomfortably in his uniform. "And I intend to prove it." No one in that courtroom could have predicted how the events of the next 72 hours would not only change the lives of everyone present, but would force an entire community to confront truths they had spent decades pretending didn't exist. It had begun on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Mapleton, the kind of autumn day where the air carried both the lingering warmth of summer and the crisp promise of winter. Zora Washington had just left Mapleton STEM Academy, her backpack heavy with advanced calculus textbooks and the prototype for her upcoming science fair project, a self-regulating urban microgarden that could help address food deserts in communities like the one where her grandmother had grown up. At 10 years old, Zora possessed a mathematical mind that had university professors puzzled and impressed. Her IQ tests had placed her in the exceptional range, but what truly set her apart wasn't just raw intelligence. It was her ability to see patterns and solutions where others saw only problems. Her mother, Imani, a respected defense attorney in Mapleton County, had nurtured this gift while trying to ensure Zora still experienced the joys of childhood. "Mom's going to be in court until 6, Zora muttered to herself, checking the vintage Casio calculator watch her grandfather had given her, a family heirloom from 1985 that she treasured more than the sleek smartwatch her mother had bought her last Christmas. "That gives me approximately 90 minutes at the library." The Mapleton Public Library stood like an aging sentinel at the edge of Oakwood Park, its red brick facade a reminder of a time when public buildings were constructed with both permanence and beauty in mind. For Zora, it was a sanctuary, one of the few places where her mind could expand in peaceful contemplation. She had just settled into her favorite corner, a worn leather armchair tucked beside the tall windows in the mathematics section, when the commotion started. Raised voices echoed from the main entrance, shattering the library's sacred silence. Curiosity pulled Zora from her chair toward the sound. "You can't just barge in here without a warrant," Mrs. Chen, the head librarian who had been helping patrons find the perfect book since the Reagan administration, stood her ground against two uniformed police officers. At 68, Eleanor Chen had witnessed the library transform from card catalogs to digital databases, but her commitment to protecting the sanctity of knowledge remained unchanged. "Ma'am, we received a report of suspicious activity." Officer Miller's voice carried an edge of authority that bounced off the library's vaulted ceilings. "Someone matching the description of a known shoplifter from Marshall's department store was seen entering this building." Zora stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. She hadn't been to Marshall's in weeks, not since her mother had taken her shopping for new school clothes. A flutter of unease settled in her stomach as she noticed the officer's eyes scanning the room, eventually landing on her. "Hey, you," Officer Miller's partner, a younger officer named Dawson, called out to Zora. "Come over here for a minute." Clutching her notebook to her chest, Zora approached slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Yes, sir. Where'd you get that backpack?" Officer Miller asked, his eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance from her neatly braided hair to her STEM Academy uniform. "It's mine," Zora answered, confusion evident in her voice. "My mom bought it for me at the beginning of the school year." Officer Dawson exchanged a glance with his partner. "And what's in it? Mind if we take a look?" Before Zora could respond, Mrs. Chen stepped between them. "Officers, this is Zora Washington. She's one of our regular patrons and a gifted student at the STEM Academy. Surely you don't think this child is your shoplifter?" "Just doing our job, ma'am," Officer Miller replied, his tone softening slightly in the face of Mrs. Chen's defense. "But the description we received was of a young African-American in a blue jacket. We need to check." Zora felt her throat tight. "My jacket is navy, not blue," she said quietly, the distinction suddenly seeming critically important. "Look, kid," Officer Dawson said with a sigh that suggested impatience rather than empathy. These things would go a lot faster if people like you would just cooperate instead of arguing semantics. People like me? The words escaped Zora's lips before she could stop them, her mother's lessons about standing up for herself warring with her grandfather's warnings about interactions with law enforcement. Officer Miller's radio crackled to life, a dispatcher's voice cutting through the tension. Units responding to the marshal's shoplifting, be advised suspect has been apprehended at the bus station on Main. Relief flooded through Zora, but it was short-lived. Well, Officer Dawson said, not quite meeting her eyes, guess it wasn't you after all, though I'm surprised. Usually these math books aren't exactly light reading for what? Mrs. Chen challenged, her normally soft voice taking on an edge that Zora had never heard before. For kids from the East Side, Officer Miller finished, though Zora suspected that wasn't what his partner had been about to say. You must be one of those scholarship cases at the academy. Good for you trying to better yourself. The condescension in his voice made the compliment feel like an insult, and Zora felt heat rising to her cheeks. She wanted to tell them about the algorithm she was developing, about the universities already sending her brochures, about the national mathematics competition she had won last spring. Instead, she remained silent, her grandfather's voice echoing in her mind. Sometimes, Zora Bird, the smartest thing to do is to say nothing at all. As the officers left, Mrs. Chen placed a gentle hand on Zora's shoulder. Are you all right, dear? Zora nodded, but the encounter had left a sour taste in her mouth. For the first time, the library no longer felt like a sanctuary. When Imani Washington arrived to pick up her daughter at 6:15 p.m., she immediately sensed something was wrong. In the 15 years she had spent building her reputation as one of Mapleton County's most formidable defense attorneys, she had developed an almost preternatural ability to read people, a skill that served her well both in the courtroom and as a single mother. Zora. Imani studied her daughter's face as they walked to the car, the parking lot's sodium lights casting long shadows across the asphalt. Did something happen today? Zora hesitated, adjusting her backpack straps. Some police officers came to the library. They thought I stole something from Marshall's. Imani stopped abruptly, her keys suspended midair. They what? As Zora recounted the incident, Imani's expression shifted from concern to a controlled anger that her colleagues at the Mapleton County Courthouse knew all too well, the calm before the storm. And then he said I must be one of those scholarship cases trying to better myself, Zora finished, her voice smaller than usual. Imani took a deep breath, willing herself to remain composed for her daughter's sake. Zora, I want you to know something. What happened today wasn't about you or anything you did. Those officers made assumptions based on how you look, not who you are. I know, Mom, Zora said, her voice stronger now. It's called implicit bias. We learned about it in social studies last semester. A sad smile touched Imani's lips. Sometimes she forgot that her daughter's advanced intelligence extended beyond mathematics and science. Yes, that's exactly what it is, and tomorrow we're going to do something about it. That night after Zora had gone to bed, Imani sat at her kitchen table surrounded by legal pads and her well-worn copy of the Mapleton County Code of Police Conduct. The grandfather clock in the hallway, another family heirloom, this one from her father's side, ticked steadily as she worked, the sound reminiscent of the metronome that had kept time during her childhood piano lessons. By morning, she had a plan. The Mapleton County Police Department occupied a modern building downtown, its glass and steel architecture a stark contrast to the colonial courthouse across the street. Chief Raymond Thomas had known Imani Washington professionally for over a decade, sometimes as an adversary across the courtroom, occasionally as an ally in community policing initiatives, but always as someone who commanded respect. Counselor Washington, Chief Thomas greeted her, rising from behind his desk as his assistant showed her in. This is an unexpected pleasure. What brings you to my office without a subpoena in hand? Imani didn't return his smile. I'm here about an incident involving my daughter yesterday at the Mapleton Public Library. As she detailed Zora's encounter with Officers Miller and Dawson, the chief's expression grew increasingly troubled. By the time she finished, the jovial facade had disappeared entirely. I want to see the body camera footage, Imani stated, not a request but a demand. Counselor, you know there are procedures for Ray, Imani interrupted, using his first name deliberately. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is you show me that footage now as a courtesy to a concerned parent. The hard way involves formal complaints, media attention, and the kind of scrutiny neither of us wants for this department. Chief Thomas studied her for a long moment before reaching for his phone. Jenkins, pull the body cam footage from Officers Miller and Dawson yesterday. Library call around 4:30 p.m. 30 minutes later, Imani sat in a small conference room watching the encounter through the dispassionate eye of Officer Miller's body camera. The footage confirmed everything Zora had told her, but seeing it, hearing the dismissive tone, witnessing her daughter's face fall as the officers made their assumptions ignited a fury that all her years of courtroom discipline could barely contain. When the video ended, she turned to Chief Thomas. I want a formal apology to my daughter. I want those officers to undergo additional training on racial bias. And I want a review of all similar encounters over the past 6 months to determine if this is a pattern. Imani, I understand you're upset, but that's a tall order for what was essentially a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Imani's voice remained level, but her eyes flashed. Is that what we're calling racial profiling now? Because I'd be happy to let a judge decide what to call it. Chief Thomas sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped gray hair, a remnant of his 20 years in the Marine Corps before joining the police force. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing consequences, Ray. Meaningful ones. What Imani Washington didn't know as she left the police station that morning was that her confrontation with Chief Thomas would set in motion a chain of events that would divide Mapleton along lines that had existed beneath the surface for generations. Lines of race, class, and power that many had pretended were relics of a bygone era. By that afternoon, word had spread through the department about the defense attorney's demands. Officer Brendan Miller, a 20-year veteran with a spotless record, felt his reputation was being smeared over what he considered a routine investigation. His partner, Officer James Dawson, merely 3 years on the force, worried about his future in law enforcement. This is ridiculous, Miller complained in the break room, loud enough for several colleagues to hear. We were responding to a description. What were we supposed to do? Ignore it because she's some lawyer's kid? Sergeant Vivian Rodriguez, who had been with the department for 15 years and had seen far too many similar situations escalate unnecessarily, set down her coffee mug with deliberate care. What you were supposed to do, Miller, was treat that child with the same respect you'd want someone to show your own kids. I've seen the footage. Miller's face flushed. So now you're taking her side, too? Since when did doing our jobs become a crime? It's not about sides, Rodriguez replied evenly. It's about acknowledging when we get it wrong and doing better next time. But as the debate spread beyond the break room to social media and eventually the local news, it became very much about sides. The incident at the library transformed from a questionable interaction between 2 officers and a child into a referendum on policing in Mapleton. For Zora, the growing controversy created a different kind of problem. As she walked through the halls of Mapleton STEM Academy the next day, she felt the weight of curious stares and hushed conversations that stopped when she approached. Is it true your mom is suing the entire police department? Her lab partner, Elliot, asked during their advanced chemistry class. No, Zora replied, carefully measuring copper sulfate for their experiment. She just wants them to acknowledge what happened was wrong. My dad says the police were just doing their job, said Madison, another classmate whose father was a city councilman. He says people are too sensitive these days. Zora focused on the blue crystals dissolving in the beaker, watching the color spread through the clear liquid rather than responding. She thought about the patterns of dissolution, about molecules and chemical reactions, things that followed predictable rules unlike people, whose reactions often seemed governed by forces she couldn't quite calculate. Meanwhile, Imani faced her own professional challenges. Judge Walter Hargrove, known for his pro-law enforcement stance, seemed surprisingly cold during her morning appearance in his courtroom. Defense attorney Marcus Phillips, normally collegial despite their frequent opposition in court, made a point of speaking loudly about lawyers who use their children for political stunts while standing near her in the courthouse corridor. It was District Attorney Alina Fitzgerald who finally addressed the elephant in the room, catching Imani in the courthouse library during the lunch recess. You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest, counselor, Alina said, sliding into the chair across from Imani with the grace that had made her a formidable presence in Mapleton's courtrooms for over 3 decades. At 68, with her silver hair always perfectly coiffed and her suits impeccably tailored, Alina had been both mentor and occasional adversary to Imani since her earliest days as a public defender. That wasn't my intention, Imani replied, closing the case file she'd been reviewing. Perhaps not, but it was predictable. Aliner's voice held no accusation, merely stating a fact. This town has been avoiding this conversation for decades. Your daughter's experience just brought it to the surface. Imani sighed, removing her glasses to rub the bridge of her nose. I knew there would be pushback, Aliner. I just didn't expect it to come from within these walls, too. The law isn't separate from the society it serves, Imani. You know that better than most. Aliner paused, studying the younger attorney. What's your end game here? It was a fair question, one that Imani had been asking herself since leaving the police station yesterday. Justice for my daughter would be the simple answer, but it's more than that. Zora won't be the last black child to be treated with suspicion for simply existing in a space someone decided she didn't belong in. I want accountability, yes, but I also want change. Aliner nodded slowly. Then you'd better be prepared for a longer fight than you anticipated. Change doesn't come easily to institutions, especially not in Mapleton. As if to prove Aliner's point, Chief Thomas called Imani that evening with news that made her blood boil. The police union was resisting any formal disciplinary action against officers Miller and Dawson, arguing that they had followed department protocol in investigating a reported crime. They're willing to agree to the additional training, Chief Thomas explained, his voice weary over the phone. But they're drawing a line at a formal apology or anything that might imply wrongdoing. Imani paced the length of her home office, the phone pressed to her ear. That's not acceptable, Ray, and you know it. I'm trying to find middle ground here, counselor. There is no middle ground when it comes to how my daughter was treated, Imani replied, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. I'll see you in court. The next morning, Imani Washington filed a formal complaint with the Civilian Review Board, requesting a public hearing on the incident. By noon, local news stations were reporting on what they called growing tensions between the Washington family and the Mapleton Police Department. By dinner time, the story had been picked up by national outlets, framed within the larger context of race and policing in America. For Zora, watching her mother's determination in the face of mounting pressure awakened something within her, a realization that mathematics and science weren't the only areas where precision and evidence mattered. Justice, too, required both. Mom, she said that night as they sat at the kitchen table, Imani reviewing documents for the hearing while Zora worked on her science fair project. I want to speak at the hearing. Imani looked up, surprised. Zora, you don't have to do that. In fact, I've been trying to shield you from as much of this as possible. I know, but it's my story. I should be the one to tell it. Zora's voice was quiet but resolute. You always say that statistics without context are just numbers. Well, I'm the context, Mom. Pride swelled in Imani's chest, tempered with the fierce protectiveness that had defined her parenting since the day Zora was born. Are you sure? Once you step into that hearing room, things will change. The media will know your name. People will have opinions about you that have nothing to do with who you really are. Zora considered this, her analytical mind weighing the variables as she would an equation. They already have opinions about me based on what I look like. At least this way, they'll hear my voice too. Imani reached across the table, covering her daughter's hand with her own. Then we'll do it together. The Civilian Review Board hearing was scheduled for Friday afternoon in Courtroom 312 of the Mapleton County Courthouse. A room Imani knew well from her years of legal practice, but that now felt different, charged with a personal significance that transcended professional duty. As Imani and Zora approached the courthouse steps that morning, they were met by an unexpected sight. A small group of supporters had gathered, holding signs with messages like "Justice for Zora" and "Bias has no place in Mapleton." Among them stood Mrs. Chen, the librarian, and several teachers from the STEM Academy. But there were others too, a contingent of off-duty police officers and their families, wearing blue ribbons and holding signs supporting officers Miller and Dawson. The division that Aliner had predicted was now visible for all to see. Inside the courthouse, the hallway outside Courtroom 312 buzzed with tension. Reporters clustered in corners, speaking in hushed tones to their cameras. Community leaders huddled in impromptu strategy sessions. Officers Miller and Dawson stood with their union representative and the department's attorney, a united front in their crisp uniforms. Judge Hargrove had been assigned to oversee the hearing, a development that Imani viewed with concern given his reputation. As they waited for the proceedings to begin, Imani noticed a familiar figure approaching them, District Attorney Aliner Fitzgerald. "Counselor Washington," Aliner greeted her formally, though her eyes held a warmth that belied her professional tone. "Ms. Washington," she added, nodding to Zora with a genuine smile. "I've heard remarkable things about your academic achievements." "Thank you, ma'am," Zora replied, her posture straightening slightly at the recognition. Alina turned back to Amani, lowering her voice. I wanted you to know that I've assigned Ada Bennett to represent the department today. He has specific instructions to find a resolution that acknowledges what happened without creating unnecessary division. Imani raised an eyebrow. That's unexpected. Is it? Alina's smile was enigmatic. Perhaps you've forgotten that I was one of the first women of color to serve in this courthouse. I may have chosen a different path than you, counselor, but that doesn't mean I don't recognize injustice when I see it. Before Imani could respond, the bailiff called for attention. All rise. The Civilian Review Board hearing in the matter of Washington v. Mapleton Police Department is now in session, the Honorable Judge Walter Hargrove presiding. As they entered the courtroom, Imani felt Zora's hand slip into hers, a gesture they had abandoned years ago as Zora asserted her independence. In that moment, despite all her academic achievements and maturity beyond her years, Zora was simply a 10-year-old girl about to face a system much larger than herself. The hearing began with formalities, introductions of the board members, statements of purpose, procedural explanations. Judge Hargrove, a man whose 65 years had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth, surveyed the packed courtroom with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Before we proceed, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of his 30 years on the bench, I want to be clear that this is not a trial. We are here to review the facts of an incident and determine if departmental policies were followed or if those policies themselves need revision. This is about improving our community, not dividing it further. The department's attorney presented their case first, arguing that Officers Miller and Dawson had responded to a specific description in pursuit of their duties. He showed security footage from Marshall's department store, pointing out similarities between the actual shoplifter, a young African-American girl in a blue jacket, and Zora's appearance at the library. These officers were doing exactly what we asked them to do, investigating reports of criminal activity based on descriptions provided by witnesses, he concluded. To suggest racial bias is to ignore the reality of police work. When it was Imani's turn to speak, she approached the podium with the measured confidence that had become her trademark in courtrooms across the county. But today, she wasn't just Attorney Washington, she was Zora's mother, and that dual identity infused her words with a passion rarely displayed in her professional appearances. Your Honor, members of the board, I come before you today wearing two hats, that of an attorney familiar with the law and that of a mother who watched her child's dignity stripped away by those sworn to protect it. She methodically dismantled the department's argument, pointing out that the officers had continued their questioning even after the actual suspect had been apprehended elsewhere, that their comments about Zora being a scholarship case revealed underlying assumptions that had nothing to do with the shoplifting investigation. This isn't about whether Officers Miller and Dawson were following procedure, she argued. About whether that procedure allows for, perhaps even encourages interactions based on bias rather than evidence. It's about the message we send to children like my daughter about their place in this community. As Imani finished her presentation, she turned to Zora. With the board's permission, I'd like my daughter to speak to her experience directly. Judge Hargrove nodded, his expression softening slightly as Zora approached the podium, a step stool already in place to help her reach the microphone. At 10 years old, wearing her STEM Academy uniform with the mathematics competition ribbon pinned carefully to her cardigan, Zora Washington faced the Civilian Review Board with the same determination she brought to complex equations. My name is Zora Washington, she began, her voice clear despite her nervousness. I'm in the 5th grade at Mapleton STEM Academy, where I study advanced mathematics and science. Last year, I won the National Junior Mathematics Competition for my work on algorithmic approaches to urban planning challenges. She paused, looking directly at Officers Miller and Dawson. I'm telling you this not to brag, but because when you saw me in the library, you didn't see any of that. You saw a suspect. You saw someone who didn't belong there. You saw someone who must be getting charity to attend my school, not someone who earned her place. The courtroom remained silent as Zora continued, explaining how the incident had affected her, how for the first time she had felt unwelcome in the library that had always been her sanctuary. I understand that police officers have a difficult job, she concluded, wisdom beyond her years evident in her measured tone. But I also understand the difference between being treated with suspicion and being treated with respect. All I'm asking is for the same benefit of the doubt that you would give to any other child in Mapleton." As Zora returned to her seat, a murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Hargrove called for a brief recess before the officers would have their opportunity to respond. In the hallway, Chief Thomas approached Imani and Zora, his expression troubled. "Counselor, Ms. Washington, may I have a word?" Imani nodded, her hand protectively on Zora's shoulder. "I've been on the force for 25 years, the chief began, and I've seen my share of complaints against officers. Most of them I can dismiss as the natural friction that comes with law enforcement, but listening to your daughter just now," he shook his head slowly, "she deserved better from my department." Before Imani could respond, Officer Miller approached, his partner trailing behind him with obvious reluctance. "Ms. Washington," Miller addressed Zora directly, his usual confidence noticeably dimmed. "I want to apologize for how I spoke to you at the library. The chief is right, you deserved better." Zora studied him for a moment, her analytical mind assessing the sincerity of his words. "Thank you, Officer Miller." Officer Dawson stepped forward. "I'm sorry, too. I didn't become a cop to make kids feel bad about themselves." When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere in courtroom 312 had shifted. The department's attorney announced that Officers Miller and Dawson wished to make a statement. Officer Miller stood, his posture military straight but his expression humbled. "Your Honor, members of the board, I'd like to retract my earlier defense. The truth is, I did make assumptions about Zora Washington based on how she looked, where I thought she came from, and yes, the color of her skin. Those assumptions were wrong, and they led me to treat her in a way that no child should be treated by someone with a badge." Officer Dawson followed with his own admission, acknowledging that as a newer officer, he had been following his partner's lead but should have recognized the impact of their actions. Judge Hargrove, who had maintained a stoic expression throughout the proceedings, leaned forward. "What are you asking of this board, officers?" "We're asking for the opportunity to make this right," Miller replied. "Not just with the Washington family, but with the community we serve." The resolution that emerged from the hearing went beyond what Imani had initially demanded. Not only would Officers Miller and Dawson undergo additional training, but they would also work with Zora to develop a youth outreach program designed to build trust between law enforcement and young people in Mapleton, particularly those from marginalized communities. The department committed to reviewing and revising its procedures for responding to suspect descriptions, with input from community leaders including Imani Washington. And perhaps most significantly, Chief Thomas announced the creation of a new position within the department, a community liaison officer specifically tasked with addressing concerns about bias in policing. As they left the courthouse that afternoon, Imani and Zora were met by a crowd that had grown during the hours of the hearing. The division that had been evident that morning remained, but something else had emerged alongside it, a tentative willingness to listen, to acknowledge that experiences differed and that those differences mattered. "Did we win, Mom?" Zora asked as they made their way down the courthouse steps, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the square. Imani considered the question, thinking about the complexity of what they had set in motion. "I think we made a beginning," she answered honestly. "Change doesn't happen all at once, Zora. It happens in moments like today, when people are willing to reconsider what they thought they knew." 6 months later, Zora Washington stood at a podium in the Mapleton Community Center, presenting the findings from the first Mapleton Youth Police Dialogue Program, an initiative she had helped design alongside Officers Miller and Dawson. The data showed a marked improvement in how young people perceived local law enforcement, particularly among minority youth. In the audience, Imani watched with pride as her daughter fielded questions with confidence and clarity. Beside her sat Officer Brendan Miller, who had become an unlikely ally in the effort to transform policing in Mapleton. "Your daughter is something else, Counselor," Miller commented quietly as Zora explained a particularly complex graph showing correlation between community engagement and trust metrics. "She's going to change the world someday." "She already has," Imani replied, thinking of the ripples that had spread from that afternoon in the library, ripples that had reached far beyond Mapleton, as other communities looked to their program as a model. "We all have." As the presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause, Zora's gaze found her mother's across the crowded room. In that moment of connection, both understood that what had begun as a painful confrontation had transformed into something neither could have predicted, a pathway toward healing not just for themselves, but for an entire community that had been divided for far too long. The mathematics of justice, Zora had discovered, was more complex than any equation she had ever solved. But like all problems worth tackling, the solution began with asking the right questions and having the courage to face the answers, no matter how uncomfortable they might be. And in Mapleton, they were finally asking,